How's everybody doing? I apologize. I haven't really been making any kind of content of late, mainly because I've just been so busy with work. Um, Kind of sucks. I had to go from Europe to back here in the States, and I didn't even get a chance to see my wife and my kid, which is a real downer, super downer. Um, so I'm back in the States, but I literally got here late last night, and I'm still trying to normalize my sleep. It's funny that I'm supposed to go out in like an hour to meet with the customer to get something to eat, and I know the guy's going to drag this meal out, and I really hope that he does it, but I think he's going to. But there's been a lot of crazy stuff going on with Ukraine and Russia, which is kind of interesting to me, primarily because my wife, she's from Poland, and I'm ex-military, of course, and I served in Afghanistan. Um, and along with that, when I got out of the military and as soon as I got my college degree, I actually did a job assignment in St. Petersburg at a steel mill. And one of the things that I always love about YouTube is you'll get these people that can do some really amazing in-depth analysis based on their backgrounds and stuff. It's the kind of stuff that you used to be able to watch on like the History Channel and stuff, and they don't really make it anymore because what do they care about are those stupid gold mining shows and ancient aliens and stuff. But there's this guy P Run, I guess is his name, and he's got some really great videos. And one of his videos from like 4 months ago was this video on effectively how corruption. Well, it's in the title, how corruption's destroyed the Russian Navy or the Russian army, I should say. It's affected the Navy too. Oh my God! If you read the reports on the Moskva, what its conditions were when it was released from a shipyard and immediately went into service in Ukraine. Oh my God, it was so disastrous. Um, it's kind of depressing, but it also reminds me a lot of the job that I did in in St. Petersburg, where effectively, if a piece of equipment or a system wasn't currently in operation, if we had to shut it down for any length of time, you were going to get hit by scrappers. Like tools were going to disappear, supply parts were going to disappear, grease, fuel, oil, everything, nothing nailed down was going to disappear. And the expectation for bribes to be able to do your job was just constant, just constant. It was awful. It was really a pain in the butt to deal with. Um, Another good video, just because I mentioned the Moskva, what was it? Trying to remember the name of the channel, but there's a Scottish guy who goes into pretty good depth of, I think it's Laser Pig. Yeah, it was this channel. I know that, but it's probably not showing up because I'm on my work computer, and so my work computer kind of blanks out a lot of YouTube and stuff, which is a bit annoying. The whole thing about all this is so sad and pathetic because it's getting a lot of conscripts on the Russian side killed. And I know there are people out there that are like, well, if they didn't want this war, they shouldn't have voted for it. They haven't had free elections in Russia in who knows how long. The only opposition leader that they ever had that had a remote chance of even threatening Putin's power has been he's in the like day 600 of being in a prison camp where they're just waiting for him to die of tuberculosis. There is no free elections in Russia, and there haven't been since Yeltsin. But ultimately, this is kind of what Russia has created is a scenario where um, an inner circle has purged itself of anybody with common sense and anybody who has any idea of what they're doing, and it's just filled with yes men, and it's getting a lot of people killed, and it's sad and pathetic. What is interesting was the bridge feeding the Crimea was just hit, That bridge was built by the Russians after they took over Crimea as a way of bypassing Ukraine. And that bridge kind of represented Russia's claims on Crimea. It's a very, very important bridge because basically 100% of their supplies for that entire region have to go through there. They can't take it by boat because it's going to get hit. Um, you're talking about an absolutely vital railway that has to be protected, and it got hit. 4-lane highway, and then the rail line. And right now, the only thing that's open is one of the lanes going across the bridge. I'm sure the people in Crimea are trying to stockpile as much as they can, fuel and food and stuff, but it's absolutely crazy to me to see how utterly inept the Russian military is, yet at the same time, the Russian leadership is trying to play dumb and say, well, we had no idea. And it's like, this is what happens when you believe your own hype. It's a very, very dangerous, precarious situation for the government to be in. You kind of already see what they're going to do is they're going to come up with some scapegoat officers, blame them, purge them. It's not really going to result in anything good. I know a lot of people imagine, well, why don't they just move their full military into Ukraine? They have a massive military. Well, they have a massive military on paper. Like the total number of troops that the active troops that the Soviet or the Russians have isn't known even by the Russians because there are so many different. There's so much corruption. You have literally paper divisions and stuff. They don't even know how many tanks they have because so many tanks have been stolen, misappropriated, were sold but never built, kind of thing. It's an utter fiasco. You can't run a military like this. You certainly can't run a military operation like this. Russia doesn't have the infrastructure to ship large units into Ukraine. It certainly has shown that it doesn't have the infrastructure or the know-how or even the resources to properly supply even a paltry number of units. At the end of the day, people always imagine that war is won by boots on the ground. That's really not true. The wars are won through the boring shit, which is supply. It's resource allocation. It's making sure you have enough fuel and stuff, and making sure that fuel goes to the right place. And these are things that, when you have large scale corruption like this, are completely and utterly hampered to the point that it's pointless to even try. Um, I'm still trying to wrap my head around a couple of things. Again, I'm blown away how Putin's inner circle were able to self-isolate themselves from reality so severely that they didn't recognize the issues. The other thing is like the whole goal of like preventing NATO encroachment. Well, that was a cell phone. I never thought in my lifetime that I would see Finland um, give up its neutrality, and I mean it did it in a heartbeat because this conflict has shown that if you're not part of NATO, Russia will not respect your boundaries. They won't respect pretty much anything. The performance of the Russian military has been absolutely, utterly atrocious. The way that they're treating civilians um, is insane. Where you're seeing these, quote unquote, Russian towns that are predominantly occupied by Russian people that identify as Russian who don't speak Ukraine, and they're greeting the Ukrainians as liberators because these Russian troops, especially the conscripts, aren't getting paid. Even if they were getting paid, the amount of money that they get paid is paltry. They don't get any kind of training. They barely have any kind of supplies or anything. So they end up stealing anything that moves. Like, I really don't understand how anyone thought this was a good idea. But then again, if there's been one thing with the Russian, with the dictatorship of Putin has been, if you don't tell him what he wants to hear, you're a dead person. I mean, this was why during the outbreak of COVID, doctors in Russia were basically getting thrown from like 12-story buildings, and this is something that really didn't make the news in the West. There's also some interesting things going on because this kind of aligns with what happened during the first Chechen War. There was this quiet little thing that happened called the Aluminum Wars, and that was when the price of aluminum was through the roof. The Russian aluminum companies were making a tremendous amount of money, and so what was happening was the owners and the CEOs of aluminum companies were basically all falling out of high-rise buildings. And the theory has been that at the time, Russia was finding itself very, very isolated. It was it was getting very hard to get hard currency in the country. And so the theory was that the FSB, which is, the new KGB, the FSB was basically finding these guys, talking to them in their office, saying, "Hey, the payouts that you normally could do to, the bribes you're normally paying out, we're going to need a lot more money." And if they balked at it, they just threw them out the window. And then the next guy in line is like, "Okay, are we going to have to do that to you?" And of course, no. You see a guy in front of you get thrown out of the building into his death. You're much less likely to try to protest. And it sounds like now they're doing the same thing. The oil executives. It's something like I think it's between 24 and 26 oil executives have very quietly all had accidents in the span of the last 6 months. And this kind of corresponds to a situation in Russia where money's drying up and bribes still have to get paid and stuff. That's the thing that it's always so odd with these regimes like Putin, where on paper they seem so solid, so rigid, but in reality it involves a lot of palms being greased. And the sanctions are definitely working. They're absolutely working. And things are getting harder and harder and harder for these oligarchs until eventually they're going to decide, we're not putting up with this. The other big thing is they're in a very tricky situation where they got to blame somebody for the military failures. Well, they can't blame Putin because he represents the entire regime. So now what they're going to start doing is they're blaming the military officers. They're going to purge the military officers. They've already announced they're going to bring in this guy who was in charge of the Syrian operations, which involved a horrible amount of human rights abuses, gas attacks and stuff. And supposedly he's going to take over operations in Ukraine, which is kind of showing both an escalation and also a severe desperation. The problem that Russia is having is all eyes are on them. This is basically happening in Europe, which, as cruel as it is to say, people care about Europe more than they care about Africa, more than they care about Asia, more than they care about a lot of places. And there's all this talk about them escalating, like internally. This is coming internally from like Russia's version of like CNN, saying that we need to start using tactical nukes, we need to start using chemical weapons and stuff. And it's like their biggest problem is nobody in Russia wants to fight. Like the average Russian doesn't want to fight for a regime that the entire reason why people tolerated that regime was, you just make sure I have my electricity, I don't want to have too much chaos, and just make sure I have food in my belly. And for the life of me, I cannot understand why the Putin regime expected this to go well. It is interesting to me because I spent roughly, for all intents and purposes, 10 years of my life dedicated to trying to support and build up the country of Afghanistan to defend themselves, only for them to, it wasn't a surprise. Anybody that was surprised by the fall of Afghanistan wasn't paying attention. But it was just weird because it was a group of people that did not care about their country. They didn't care about having a central government, and we gave them everything possible. Whereas in Ukraine, we really haven't given them anything that much. We still haven't shipped them a single tank. All their heavy armor that they've been using, the Russians have accidentally given to them. because they don't train the Russians don't train their conscripts to even understand how to retreat effectively. They don't know to destroy their own tanks that they're abandoning and stuff. So they're finding brand new tanks for all intents and purposes. But the only reason that they couldn't keep driving the tanks was they ran out of fuel because the crew sold the fuel. So like it's a brand new tank and they don't even set fire to it. They just leave it there. For the Ukrainians to go through, repurpose it, or paint it, and then put it right back into the field. It's insanity. It's utter insanity. Um, I'm trying to think of the last time a major military power has failed across the board as badly as Russia has stumbled. And I keep seeing on like Twitter and stuff, people talking about how well now it's serious. They blew up the bridge. Now they can bring in their whole military. They can't bring in their whole military. If they try to move all their internal military forces, again, I mentioned it before, they don't have the resources to actually effectively move that many men into position. Secondly, um, the Russian military is used for internal security, a lot of internal security. It's not like the United States. When we deployed troops to Afghanistan, it wasn't like whole swaths of the United States could potentially turn into bandit territory because we still had police, we still had civil servants and stuff like that. Where in a lot of parts of Russia, especially once you get away from like the major cities, um, it's like going back into the Middle Ages, where the military units are the law. They're the law, they're your police, they're your fighting services, and so on. So if you pull all these men away, there's nothing there. And I don't know. It's just this was a tremendous self-own across the board, politically, economically, militarily. This was an incredible shotgun to a foot. I really thought the U.S. going to Afghanistan was remarkably stupid. I was on active duty when 9/11 happened, and when we decided to go into Afghanistan, I was just like, why? Why? Average Afghan has no idea who the hell Osama bin Laden is, let alone knows what 9/11 was or that New York City even exists. There's no point in us going in there. And we did it anyway. And of course, Osama bin Laden was in Pakistan, our ally. Middle Eastern politics. But like, I don't know. I really what it comes down to is this is the danger of dictatorship. This is what happens when you have an inner circle that's been so effectively purged of dissenting voices that nobody's there to idiot check you. And I mean, like these generals and all, it's amazing. You'll see these generals in Russia, and it's always the same where they make the equivalent of like $100,000 USD a year as like the top general in Russia, only to find out that he lives in like a $24 million Dachau that was paid for by or it's his 18-year-old daughter's mansion, and it's all because of kickbacks and bribes and stuff. I mean, again, that steel mill job I did in St. Petersburg was just miserable because everything got stolen. Every single thing got stolen. I've done steel mill jobs in like Gary, Indiana, Detroit. Um, I've done steel mill jobs in India and China, and I've never been to a place where so much stuff was stolen. Constantly, just constantly stolen. Everything was stolen. You couldn't leave anything sitting down. And I mean, there were times in Afghanistan it felt like this, but like that's completely different. That's a third world. Essentially, it was supposed to be a third world country compared to Russia. Russia, yeah, it's not supposed to be the best country on the planet, but it's also not supposed to be like this third world shithole. But that's the thing with Russia. Once you leave Moscow, you leave. I forget. I always forget what Stalingrad's turned into. The naming. Or if you leave, doing the same thing. I can't remember what Leningrad. St. Petersburg. Once you leave like those major cities like that, the quality of life just goes in the toilet. Like Russia only has running water in a third of their hospitals. Um, It's crazy when you go into the interior just how backwoods it is. Um, but I mean, again, I see them people on Twitter and stuff. They're like, "Oh, well, this is what the Russians wanted." And again, they don't get to vote. Well, yeah, they have elections. The elections are a joke. It's just like the vote that they had for the 3 or 4 occupied territories, where they're going, door to door with an armed guy, and you got to vote, and you know exactly which way you're supposed to vote, kind of thing. It's not to that extent in Russia, but it's close. It's to the point that the vast majority of Russians don't bother to vote because it's a joke. It's a joke. So now, I don't know what's going to happen in the future. Um, I've got a strong suspicion that if they don't start having major military success, there's going to be a push to start stripping more and more members, more and more high level people from the military of their power and throw them in prison and stuff. And prison in Russia is basically a death sentence. Um, I could see it where powerful people in the military start getting pissed off for this. Because ultimately, you can blame the generals and all, but they're just as hampered by corruption as anybody else. Just it's like blaming the conscripts kind of thing. Um, I can't imagine a worse job in the world right now than being made like Russian military commander for the Crimea area. Because what are you supposed to do? You don't have troops. You really don't have troops. You have conscripts, and there's limitations to what you can get out of conscripts. That Wagner group is a joke. Um, they're supposed to be these super elite guys, and they're a guy who's in charge of the Wagner group is trying to go into prisons and just hire or enlist warm bodies. It's a fucking train wreck, absolute train wreck. And I mean, they're shipping guys off to the front with like a week's worth of training, and they're giving them gear that's from like the 1950s, and it's just insane. It's utterly insane. And I know back when I was in, you'd hear stories about like U.S. military members like purchasing gear and stuff. We were purchasing stuff to make our lives a little bit more comfortable. Like the body armor stuff. And for me, because I'm such a big guy, a lot of my gear didn't fit me very well because I'm so tall. Like I was literally at the height where they actually made me get a medical waiver for how big I am. So like I would always buy, like as soon as I got out of basic training, I bought a different pair of boots because my feet did not fit in my boots whatsoever. They gave me the biggest pair of boots the military would issue me. They didn't fit. So I bought my own boots. It's completely different than if I got conscripted and they just never gave me boots whatsoever. I could still have survived with those boots. I would have been uncomfortable. I would have been miserable, but at least I had combat boots. Where like some of the images and stuff that I'm seeing coming out of Russia, it's insane. It's absolutely insane. So I don't know. I don't know if Russia. I don't think anytime soon Russia's going to fall. What's so goofy to me is even if like tomorrow Ukraine was like, okay, we're going to negotiations. Nobody's going to normalize relations with Russia. Like no one is. And right now, even Russia's allies like India and China, they're going to make off like bandits on them. They're going to like because Russia is so desperate right now for hardware and stuff and basic parts. Uh, it's going to be a further decline of Russia. Um, but it's like like China's got a lot of corruption. China has a lot of like any country that has like all this centrally planned management stuff. It's very very prone to corruption. But it is so hard to describe to somebody how frustratingly bad the corruption is in Russia. And uh, and then the other thing too is like you mentioned to people like, well, I feel bad for both sides, and like people can't understand it. And so, well, I don't feel bad for Putin inner circle. I don't feel bad for any of the conscripts that are committing like war crimes and stuff. But I do feel bad for like you will see it where there are guys that are like 40 years old, they're blind in one eye, and they're being called up because they don't have political connections to get out, get out of these drafts. And I'll tell you this right now: the whole, the original mobilization where they're like, "Oh, we're only calling up like 100,000 guys, and they all have prior military experience." Yes, technically, it's sometime in their lifetime they quote unquote served as reservists. I guarantee you, they never showed up to any single period of time to get training or anything. They were just on the books, and that's always been a problem with Russia, where they have ghost divisions and stuff. So like a lot of these guys that are being called up, they've never held a gun before, even though they quote unquote are a reservist. And a lot of them don't even know that they're a reservist until somebody comes in and tells them, "You're a reservist. You're leaving now." And so it's a really screwed up situation. But I don't know. I just try to stay awake. It's getting close to when I should get dressed and head off to this meal. Pray for me. I'm really hoping that this customer doesn't want to stay up all night and boozing and shit. Especially since I don't drink, which is always awkward whenever I go to these things and want to like drink with me. It's like I don't drink. What do you mean you don't drink? I'm an alcoholic. Although I will say this: in America, I find people don't have a problem with this. It's completely different in China and Japan, where they seem to take the offense that I don't drink. But anyhow, everybody take care of themselves. Hopefully, we don't hit World War III.